So I imagine you may be a little bit frustrated, a little bit annoyed, a little bit put down by this coronavirus issue that we're all dealing with nowadays. Not being able to do things that we like doing, not being able to be with people we like to be with, perhaps losing jobs or losing time. A lot of this is really frustration and difficult, but there's also a lot we can learn from it. We can put this time to good use by using it to increase our wise understanding of the way that the world works. I'll discuss that coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org, where you can get courses about early Buddhist Dharma that might help also to increase your sense of wisdom. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, that's what we deal with on this channel, consider subscribing and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So, Bhikkhu Bodhi recently has done a number of short videos about the coronavirus, things that he sees as important, and they're really wonderful. I'll put a link to one of them down below where he discusses, or at least mentions, this topic that I'm going to get into today, which is that we can use this time as a kind of a wisdom teaching. Life has its ups and downs, and the ups can be a lot of fun, the downs not so much. But oftentimes we can use times like these to become wiser, to become more, to have a deeper understanding of the way that the world really does work, as opposed to sort of skating along in normal ignorance, which is the way we often view the world, frankly. And in particular, I think times like these can help us to avoid apathy. Because what normally happens in our ordinary life is that we get kind of apathetic with the way things are. We sort of expect it to unfold in a certain way. We have ordinary days follow ordinary days. There's a certain routine to life, the way we saw it before. It's the sort of thing that we could count on, we could depend upon, at least within the ordinary bounds that we normally think of as life. And as a result, we can become sort of apathetic. We can get stuck in ruts of various kinds. We can come to believe that life is more, shall we say, believable, credible, the sort of thing that we can depend upon than it actually is. Indeed, ordinarily we think of life as sort of going on as usual forever, perhaps getting a little bit better as time goes into the future. Oftentimes, many of us in the West tend to think that way, that life just gets better and better. And then a thing like this comes along, and it's as though we've sort of woken up from a dream. Things all of a sudden seem more vivid, more real, perhaps, because all of a sudden our ordinary life has sort of been pulled away from us, and we're in something quite new. Something that seemed so solid and secure, that is, the life that we had before, proved to be not so much, proved to be rather insecure, proved to be the sort of thing that we really couldn't count on. And it's all because of something so small that we can't even see it. It's this tiny little coronavirus. Something so minute, so apparently unimportant. I mean, the sort of thing that we would literally overlook. So that something tiny can change everything. And that's, I think, a good lesson for all of us. Something tiny, something unknown, something unseen can change everything. There's a wonderful Japanese aesthetic known as Ukiyo-e, which is translated sometimes as the floating world. An aesthetic of paintings, of prints, that were originally, well, it originated in the 17th century, went through till the 19th century, began as depictions of urban pleasure districts. And these were depicted as being the sorts of things that were evanescent, that came and went, that were beautiful for a time. There is a sense of poignancy to the depictions of life at that time in this kind of aesthetic. This idea that beautiful times may come, but then they also go. And this idea of Ukiyo-e, which means floating world, also implies a world of sorrow. It's the world of samsara, this world of constant change, of constant revolutions, if you like, of birth and death, of things getting pretty and then decaying. And this is the kind of thing that we know now, that if you build your life, as many of us do, around this kind of aesthetic, around a beauty, around the normal life that we all want to have, if we build our lives around that, we're destined towards suffering. That is the lesson that we get from the Buddhist Dharma. It's also the lesson that we can get from something like the coronavirus. Now, the Buddha had a very sophisticated and detailed story or understanding of how our sense of beauty and positivity arose within us from contact with things in the external world. That is, that we have various senses, and those senses come into contact with things in the external world, things that we see, things that we hear, things that we taste. All of these can be thought of as aesthetic in some sense. And this contact that we have with things produces feelings within us. Now, the word that used in early Buddhism for feelings doesn't mean emotions, although those also would arise, but rather it means either pleasant or unpleasant feelings or neutral feelings. These all arise within us. And also within us we have what are called underlying tendencies. We have certain tendencies that arise within us from within, that is to say, the way our minds tend to be constructed. We have an underlying tendency towards greed, towards wanting to own or possess things. We have an underlying tendency towards aversion, towards wanting to push other kinds of things away from us, wanting not to have certain things. And we have the deepest of all underlying tendencies, an underlying tendency towards ignorance, towards not really wanting to see the way that the world actually is. And this underlying tendency towards greed that we have, when it comes, as it were, when we have pleasant feelings arise, this tendency towards greed makes us cling to them. We have a pleasant feeling, we have greed for it. That greed within us arises. We want the pleasant feeling to continue. And when the pleasant feeling doesn't continue, as we've seen now, perhaps, many of us, with this recent coronavirus, we had pleasant feelings before, at least we think back on them pleasantly, then they fall away. And what does that happen? What happens is an arising of pain that in their stead. In other words, when they go away, what happens is an arising of pain. On the other hand, when pain arises or an unpleasant feeling arises, then we have this underlying tendency towards rejection or towards aversion, to push these things away, to not want them within us. So we see something that's unpleasant. We have to deal with an unpleasant situation. We have unpleasant thoughts. Aversion arises within us. And when these things don't go away, that aversion can turn into anger, can turn into frustration, can turn into even hatred. These kinds of very strong emotions can arise when aversion isn't successful, when our initial tendency towards aversion isn't able to push away the things that we don't like. But I would submit that for many of us, and perhaps for you as well, when we look back on the time before, let's say, the coronavirus, when we think of our lives, we think perhaps less of pleasant, very, very pleasant experiences or very, very unpleasant experiences. We think in the main, in our general life, as we generally see it, as being sort of neutral. That is to say, we get up, we go to work, we do what we have to do, we come home, we have normal kinds of meetings with colleagues or family. That's a kind of a neutral life, at least for many of us, for the most part. And that kind of life is a life that, in the Buddha's understanding, tends to be productive of or go along with ignorance. That is to say, our ordinary tendency towards ignorance tends to be involved when we are in neutral feelings. we tend to become apathetic. And apathy is really the point that I want to get across here, is that learning the wisdom of this time that we're dealing with now, with coronavirus, can be particularly useful in thinking about apathy. That is, in an ordinary life where we feel sort of neutral, we become incurious, we become bored, we become, again, apathetic. We don't really care so much. And we can let things slide. Now, I'll come back to this in a moment, but the main idea is that we can see all three of these tendencies within us and within society at large if we look back on the time before the arising of this virus, because I think the arising of a different time can give us an ability to look with more clarity upon the past. If we think back to the way things were a few months ago, as well as, frankly, the way things are now, is that there is a lot, and certainly was, a lot of uncertainty within society. Uncertainty producing difficulties, producing aversion within certain segments of society, producing perhaps anger and hatred, perhaps tribalisms of one kind or another, not wanting certain people to be around them, not wanting, let's say, people from other countries to be here, or wherever you are. That kind of thing is productive of anger, is productive of difficulty within society. That is, uncertainty of a certain kind, unpleasant feelings among people leads to anger, leads to hatred, leads to tribalisms, leads to clinging to I, me, and mine, as opposed to them. When people feel that their identity is threatened, they tend to lash out, they tend to get angry. That's a normal way that the Buddha would say we tend to behave. And then within a certain segment of society, we may say a very small segment, you may have people who are really caught up in pleasures, in seeking pleasures, in being successful at seeking pleasures, in wanting to preserve their access to wealth and money and the ability to do what they want. And that can lead also to greed, or at least the greed within us, when we're in that kind of situation, can propagate into a wish to grab more for ourselves. And that also we can see if we look back and indeed look at the world right now. But many, perhaps most of us, are in that in-between stage. We're not angry and hurting on the one hand, and we're not greedy and filled with an interest and pleasure on the other. We're in that kind of middle. And that is where you find, again, this kind of apathy. You find the, let's say, non-voters, if you like. That's one way to understand this kind of middle group. Now, not to say that all non-voters are apathetic. Of course, many people have difficulty voting for various reasons. Perhaps they're being disenfranchised to one extent or another, or they don't have the time because they're working different jobs. There are all kinds of reasons, but certainly a large group of that, shall we say, apathetic part of society is there because of this kind of neutral in-betweenness. They're not hurting enough to really get angry, and they're not greedy enough and filled with pleasure enough to be, shall we say, wanting to grab more for themselves. They're in the middle. And the wisdom teaching of this difficult time is to be able to see all of this with greater clarity. We can perhaps begin to see the dangers of apathy, because clearly so much more could have been done if people had not been apathetic, if people had not been incurious and uninterested. So much more could have been done in advance to make this time that we're dealing with now easier, to make fewer people become affected by it, for example. It's also the case that we can see the problems of greed, because wanting more for ourselves is really a dead end. As we've seen also here, good times don't last. And whatever we grab for ourselves, we're going to have to give up eventually. Grabbing things is really not a secure route to happiness in any way. Greed itself is not happiness. And finally, we can see that hatred and aversion is not really helpful either. We're all in this together. And in particular, the coronavirus, I think, makes this eminently clear, that it does not recognize borders, it does not recognize us versus them. It simply passes from one person to another around the world. There's no way to stop it. And even during times when there were no airplanes, thousands of years ago, there were also these kinds of pandemics, terrible pandemics that killed large percentages of society. So this is not a modern problem by any means. Illness is something that affects us all. And so narrow tribalisms, we can see how problematic they can be. They make dealing with this even more difficult. But on a more positive note, we can also think of enlightened leadership that we've had in the past and that we might someday have in the future. I have an earlier video on King Ashoka, who is a wonderful Buddhist monarch, really the first Buddhist ruler in history, and a truly enlightened ruler. And I have an earlier video on him and what he stood for, and I'll put a link to it up on the screen here. I would suggest checking it out and give yourself a bit of a boost today. Thanks so much. I hope to catch you on the next one of these videos. Meanwhile, all of you be healthy and well.